Welcome to Outcomes, the healthcare and biopharma marketing podcast, where marketing leaders discuss the most effective strategies for the health sectors, coming from a digital-first, AI-powered perspective. So the next audience I want to talk about that we all know is an enormous challenge for the biopharma sector. Even though the Great Resignation has subsided a bit, we know in this particular industry, hiring top talent is very difficult. It always is. And there are certain trends in employer branding and recruitment marketing. And we've done a lot of work there for our biopharma and healthcare clients. And I see these emerging sciences and medicines. Again, we're talking about cell and gene being really advantageous in terms of attracting candidates because they want to be part of things that are actually changing the world. And we know that, the healthcare and biopharma industry has an advantage anyway in recruiting people, in that it is such a meaningful industry, but being more on the cutting edge of this type of medicine is definitely advantageous. And David, you've done a lot of work in this area with our clients. You've spoken to HR departments, recruiters, employment candidates. What are your thoughts on recruiting in this realm?
Well, I think you nailed it. The big thing is that, and especially with the younger generations coming out of school right now and everything, they want to make a difference in the world. And what better thing than what we're talking about today? I mean, it's incredible. So I think you need to put that up there, not in detail, but at a high level. And patient stories and that kind of stuff that they can easily get to. These people saved my life, and on. I think that's a big motivator. And I think what you're going to find is the people that gravitate towards medicine, we're going to gravitate towards medicine. They're just looking for the opportunity now that's really going to set them on fire, right? And feel good about what they're doing, And just backing up a little bit too, as we're talking about this employment thing, I'm thinking, why are we talking about trying to attract all these people when, in fact, a lot of pharmaceutical companies have had huge layoffs lately, and they're restructuring and so forth? And I thought about that, and the answer is really simple. There's a substantial skills gap right now in personalized medicine, especially in cell and gene sciences. And, companies, the bottom line is that companies really can't wait for the next up cycle to start hiring people. They need to fill these gaps, right? And, talent has always lagged new innovation. It's always the way it is because talent has to catch up. But right now is an incredible time to get out there and try to find some of these people, especially in the sciences, And I think the other thing to keep in mind is scientists are so different than business people, are so different than the people who want to be an executive in the company and everything. And so you can't just say, here's who we are and we're this great, company doing great things and here's some positions that are open. I think you've got to kind of take the various roles within the organization and bring it to life. We've done this in a few sites. And have people speaking about the science that's going on. We haven't done this, but I mean, can you imagine taking them into the lab and going, hey, so we're in the lab now, and scientists are going to get excited. It's like any other kind of marketing. The more finite you can get and put them in the driver's seat, as the auto salespeople used to say, and everything, and let them feel what it's like to be working there. We did work with one company that really took it to the next level. And I really thought it was great, that they had the different groups. So you want to be in the science group, meet the people, that, are in science, people just like you that just got here yesterday. And, we brought that to life, videos and everything. So, it's not one size fits all. Right now, you got to, I think good HR departments are figuring out where their skills gaps exist, and they better be hunting for them because there's going to be a lot of competition for it, without a doubt.
Definitely.
And one last thing, this is not an industry for everyone either. It's a fast-paced, dynamic environment, ability to work under pressure. These scientists, I mean, they start an experiment, they want to get it done, they want to be successful, and it's not always successful. How many times do you need to fail before you do hit success, right? The old Edison with what, 800 light bulbs or something that he tried before he had one that worked, right? And so be careful that you're not just looking to fill seats. You need people who are dedicated to wanting to be here. And if you find those people, then you'll attract them with the things that we just talked about, and the rest will be history.
Yeah, and I think going back to a point you made a couple minutes ago about how strange it is that on one hand we read about layoffs every day within the biopharma
Mm.
sector, on the other hand we're talking about the difficulty in attracting talent. Um, and I think it's a good segue into the next audience that we want to touch upon a little bit, which is investors. We are living in a very fragmented period for the biopharma sector. There are winners and losers. So many of these layoffs that you're reading about, or quite frankly, some companies even completely closing up shop, uh, they simply didn't have the strong pipelines. There
Mhm.
was just such an abundance of funding going around during peak pandemic. It got out of control, almost like the dot-com boom, right? And that's kind of what COVID was for the biopharma sector. And what's come out of that is it was an overinvestment. It was a bubble. And now for the companies that don't have strong fundamentals and their pipelines were not far enough along, those are the companies now that are having hard times getting those next rounds of funding and where you're seeing the layoffs. Whereas on the other hand, on one hand, big pharma is doing well. They've got a lot of cash. They're not struggling. But even on the small, mid-sized biopharma, the companies who have strong fundamentals, strong pipelines, but then also, this is where it's related to what we're talking about here today, the ones who are in the more emerging, promising therapies
Mhm.
that have more hope of changing the world and impacting lives, they're going to be okay with funding. It's harder. It's going to require more work. That's why we're going to talk about it a little bit here. Their stock prices are down if they're publicly traded. So it's no walk in the park from a financing perspective, but it's those companies who have more hope of significantly impacting lives that are going to be okay. And so investor attraction, investor marketing is taking on a new look too in this era. And this is a new language for them as well. And like we're talking about the other audiences, it is important to understand the investor market. Um, they're going to vary. Some of the investors are very scientifically savvy and they do understand this stuff because these are usually investors who are focused on these particular types of therapies, but they're not scientists. And like everything else, we need to customize our messages and our content to those investors. And one big way of doing that is, in addition to just
Mhm.
simplifying the language in ways they can understand it, I think you've got to come across as being a very patient centric organization. So even if you're in phase one of clinical trials, or even if you're preclinical or R&D still, you need to be showing through all of your messaging, through all of your content, that you are a patient centric organization and that you are going to impact lives at the end of the day. And I think we've seen a lot of biotechs lose sight of that focus. But we've got studies that are showing that investors, HCPs, partners, employment candidates, at the end of the day, they all want to see patient centricity. And we, as marketers, as communicators, need to be part of that shift in showing our biotech clients that it's not all about, putting a DNA helix on your homepage and talking about your proprietary science. Be about the patient and it will serve you well across all of those audiences. That's my little bit of a soapbox there. So, David, your
Yeah.
thoughts on investors?
Well, I think you got to have the patient in mind, because if the patients aren't going to step up, then the business doesn't succeed, you know. And so I think that that's critical. Everybody wants to see the empathy, but investors are a little bit different too. So here again, it's a time where you really want to be talking to the investors and figuring out how they make their decisions and everything, right? Basically, getting inside their minds. And so the first thing that they always think about is, is the exit value going to be greater than the investment I make? It's really that simple, right? And how long is that going to take? But everything that was straightforward that they based these things on is not going to be even close to straightforward anymore. It's so changing. I mean, how do you value, and can anyone afford it, a medicine that will cure somebody versus a lifetime of therapy, right? I mean, do we get to curative solution versus lifetime of therapy, equivalent lifetime of therapy? I don't know. They'll probably come up with some of these things, right? But I think there's some other things, that they're concerned about a few things with this industry. First of all, it's so new. There aren't a lot of, well, this company did it this way and it worked or whatever. So the guideposts aren't there for them that are with traditional therapies, right? And so, you know, they're thinking about some things like the well-established nature of traditional therapies. Not all of these are cut and dry. It's either or. I mean, some might be a decision to try something and it might be more expensive. Will HCPs and patients gravitate towards these new approaches? Will they gravitate to one over another that are actually competing in the same space, right? you know how many extensive R&D investment cycles are necessary, right? And is there the downstream reimbursement that's going to be necessary to fill the coffers of the discovery firm and so forth, plus all the complexity and costs that we already have with clinical trials and safety and all of this. And the requirements are much higher because we don't know everything when it comes to the personalized therapies and everything. So, the clinical trials are far more costly, and certainly the safety concerns are more expensive to put into place, right? But I think, back to your point, you know, to engage the right investors, and remember, there's five, six, seven main characters here, different types of investors, from VC to, you and me that want to invest in a company, right? And so I think, yes, you got to speak to the patient benefits, no doubt about it, right? And is there transformation in what you're doing? And and it wasn't possible until now, but you figured it out, and the impact that you'll have on communities. And again, you have these patient advocacy groups,
Yep.
that can speak to that, right? I think investors will say, wow, we already have a patient population right here, right?
Hmm.
That is working with them.
Yeah.
Um, but I think this is a game changer. We talked about it, but will it have strong financial prospects alongside low risk? Which is what they always look for, and
Right.
everyone's going to be different. So I think you got to tell the story, and again, you got to get into the minds. If you're using institutional investors, that's who you're primarily going after, or VC or whatever. It's a whole different story, and you really got to get that intersection of them and their investment habits and so forth. And the other thing that they're going to look at too is, how do payers handle all this?
Yeah.
I just said, a lifetime of therapy versus, all right, this is $50,000, a month for 12 months,
Hmm.
and now the payers are sitting there going, and so the investors don't know the answer to that. So I think you got to surround them with enough good. You've got to show that you've thought about these things, that you know what they're thinking about, you've thought about it, and you answer what's in their brain right now. You intercept their questions before they have the time to ask them in your narrative, in your messaging, and so forth. And we've done that, listening to these, but they're very different. One type class of investor to another too. So you got to really drill down, into that.
So the next point that I want to touch on a little bit, again, just from a marketing and communications perspective, is the issue of ethics and compliance.
Mhm.
And I don't mean we're not regulatory experts here or compliance officers, so that's not what I'm going into. What I'm talking about is this is new territory. There's a lot of an individual's data that will need to be used, and it's important. The onus is on the pharmaceutical company to make sure that the patients and their doctors know that you're taking care of their data, you're protecting their data, um, you are compliant with some might say, duh, well, of course they're going to be compliant with what the FDA requires. Well, not necessarily. I read on a weekly basis pharmaceutical companies who are slapped on the wrist, whether from a marketing perspective or other things that they're doing. So you can't assume that. And so my point that I'm making here is the onus is on the marketers to drive that point home and constantly reassure the patient that you're doing the right thing from an ethical standpoint. Even the genetic tests, 23andMe, they have sold their data legally. The data that they sold to pharmaceutical companies, the patient signed off on that. Whether they realize they signed off on that or not, I don't know, but they did sign off on it. So nobody broke any laws. Nobody broke any trust in technically speaking. So it's a big issue here that I just want to emphasize from a marketing standpoint, going back to that overarching point of trust and transparency, constantly be reassuring your audiences that you're going to be doing the right thing by them
Mhm.
and in the bigger picture, especially in these novel therapies.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Personalized means personalized. And, you know, citing another client that we have, I mean, so these guys must have figured it out, is that they match clinical trial candidates with clinical trials. And
Mm-hmm.
based on having the conditions and maybe even the genetics and so forth, having been treated for something that this, therapy might solve. And so they must have figured it out, how to do that and, and keep it confidential. I think it's a huge part of it. There's no doubt about it. But again, you're going to need the help of these patients to do this research. And the
Right.
smaller the N gets in statistics, the harder it is, to become accurate. And so, yeah, I think fundamentally, it, the ethics and everything. And I know that the pharmaceutical organizations have these people in place, and they're very good at what they do, and so that's got to carry on down to everything, to the website that somebody goes to and looks at. They feel really comfortable that these guys are not, they understand. You know.
Yeah, people have a lot of questions, especially when it comes to things like CRISPR and gene editing and some of the things that we've seen in the news and ways that's being used.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all that ethical. So, again, for a given pharmaceutical company who is going to be leveraging some of these sciences, it's on them to ensure that to their audiences that nothing they're doing is anything other than ethical. So we've covered a lot. David, kind of wrapping up here, do you have any kind of closing thoughts on all of this stuff?
Yeah, a few key takeaways. Um, first and foremost, do the homework before engaging these audiences. All right, and even before you even speak to them to engage them, do the homework. Right. People know when you are speaking to the masses and when you are focused on them. And a lot of these companies have been focused on speaking to the masses. And like I said, that, the person who gets a diagnosis at midnight and that kind of stuff. So you got to get inside their minds. It's not a time for generalities. You got to be really specific. Personalize is personalized. And you have to know what they're thinking about, the questions that are in their mind, and you need to address them. So I think do the homework, do the research, find somebody who can do this. I would say in any case that you're going to come across, it's going to be about 3 to 4 key audiences that you should be thinking about. You should conduct targeted research. and employ outside resources who have done this 1,000 times before, right? Map the audiences, as you said before, their personas, their health journeys, and the content that's going to move the needle for them, and then build out the messaging strategy by type and topic, varying approaches, based on these audiences. So it's the same premise. You stand
Right.
for something, but you're going to say it slightly differently to all of them. I think one of the things that we're watching here too is that all of these new therapies are not going to happen all at once. They're really not. And I think the important thing is that people can track your progression as a pharmaceutical company or whatever, CRO. What are you working on? What will it do? And broadcast the opportunity, right? And if it's a therapy company, the company's brand focus and everything. Precondition the markets if you're looking for those advocacy groups and everything for upcoming events, changes, announcing breakthroughs as they approach. Take them on the journey with you, because in a lot of cases, these are people who have been dealing with conditions for a long period of time, hoping for hope, right? And so bring them on your journey and start right from the beginning. I think that's something that we don't normally see, but again, personalized is going to be different. So that's my thought.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk a little bit about tactics, because we've talked here a lot today about strategy.
Mhm.
But ultimately, what has to come out of all of this are the tactics that you're going to use to deliver these messages and this content that we've talked about. And this is a common refrain here. Anybody who knows me, whether you're a client, other people at Imagine, I say this all the time, and maybe it's oversimplifying, but if you take the time and do a lot of the stuff that we focused on here today, David, which is speak to your audiences, understand them and their personas, map out their
Mhm.
respective journeys. If you do all of that, defining the tactics is kind of easy because you'll end up with these certain content themes and certain messages that you're going to see lend themselves to. That makes for a great video. Let's do a
Right.
patient video on that. That should be an infographic to illustrate that very scientific concept in a simple way visually. That you want to have mechanism of action videos. Some things are going to make for a good long form ebook, a shorter blog post, a webinar, a microsite, and so forth. A social media
Mhm.
campaign. You're going to want disease awareness websites. You're going to want your medical affairs website, HCP and patient focused websites, maybe investor relations websites. So the salient point here is once you've done the audience work, you've created those salient messages, mapping the tactics to them is a relatively easy thing. They might not be all that easy to create and execute all of them, but figuring out which ones you need is not that difficult at that point. We've covered a lot here today. I really appreciate your insights, and I think we'll plan on having you on for many more discussions. Thanks so much.
Be happy to do so. It's an important subject.
Thank you, David.